Thank you, Francois. Thank you so much also to Mariam for the organization. It's been a great pleasure to hear so many wonderful talks. So we've heard a lot about cognitive dynamics. One way to introduce the issue is what has recently been labeled Schiffer's puzzle, but it's basically the same issue. If you're a very broadly speaking Phrygian, you think that what Fine calls representing things as the same, other people call this coordination. Fine also uses the notion of coordination, de jure coreference. This amounts to representing things under the same concept or mode of presentation or in the same way. Yet, it seems that some thoughts have what Schiffer calls the relativity feature. Their entertainment requires the same person at different times to think of the same referent in different ways. For example, as here versus there, as today versus yesterday, as now versus then, and so on. So we seem to have a kind of tension. On the one hand, since we have representing as the same, we would want to say that the concepts are the same, but if the ways of thinking are different, that suggests the concepts are different. So what should we say? Are concepts the same or different when we think about what we take to be the same referent in ways we express using different indexicals? And Schiffer's view of this is that this basically blows up the Phrygian theory altogether. He says it's clear the Phrygian theory can't accommodate the relativity feature if an object-dependent proposition about X has the relativity feature, then there is no one mode of presentation of X under which everyone who entertains the proposition must think of X whenever or wherever the entertaining takes place. I won't be mentioning the interpersonal aspect of the issue. I'll just be focusing on the intrapersonal aspect. So my goals today aren't to directly answer Schiffer or solve this long-standing debate, but simply to hopefully bring some fresh light to it by considering what I consider to be in some ways a parallel or at least an interestingly related question, which is whether the concepts we express by using different senses, as they're called, of an inherently polysemous expression are the same or different. So why might you think there's some kind of interesting relation there? Well, on its face, polysemy also seems to involve representing reference, as I would put it, as if they're the same, despite construing them in different ways. So I'll sketch an account of polysemy, according to which it involves a very similar view to a view that's been defended by many people here, the identity of a certain kind of mental representation, which I'll call a dot file, in the model of dot concepts and dot objects in the polysemy literature. And I'll suggest that this is a kind of file that is both composite and dynamic, to use François' notions. And I'll argue that by a kind of parity of reasoning, this undercuts at least some of the motivation for a position according to which in cognitive dynamics cases, you would have to postulate different concepts or fine-grained concepts. So those are my goals for today. I'll start out by discussing a bit more Schiffer's relativity feature and try to show how dynamic files might provide what seems like an attractively simple and elegant way of dealing with it. Then I'll move on to dot files and this parity argument I briefly mentioned. And finally, if there's time, I'll move on to some objections and replies. If there isn't time, I'm sure you'll have plenty of objections. May or may not have replies. So how common really is this relativity feature? I think if we understand it rather broadly, at least on its face, it's fairly ubiquitous throughout cognition. So for instance, in Burge's recent work, he's said lots of fascinating things about, does this work? perceptual constancy phenomena. And one way of thinking of perceptual constancy, so consider the length of this edge, is that when you see this shape and you're focusing, let's say, on the length of this edge, and then you see the shape tilt, on the one hand, you represent perceptually the fact that the length has not changed, but on the other hand, it's at least intuitive, I think, to argue that there's something about the way in which you represent that length that has changed. So this might seem like it's in perception, not in a higher level cognition, something like a phenomenon in which you have representing as the same, but in different ways. A phenomenon we mentioned earlier is linguistic anaphora. So when we talk about representing as the same in language, Freudians tend to emphasize a paradigm of repeating the same proper name. But in fact, the other paradigm case is actually the main way in which we represent as the same linguistically is by using anaphoric expressions. And here too, I think we should start off with a fairly naive intuition, which is that on its face, these are different ways of representing the same referent, namely different linguistic means of representing the same individual. So you may, of course, then go on to say, at some level, that's what Fiengo and May would say, it's actually the same expression, but on its face, even anaphora suggests that representing as the same isn't a mere matter of repeating even a type identical representation. And then there's a phenomenon which was mentioned earlier, the notion of tracking. I think there are importantly different kinds of tracking. There's tracking in perception, which has been very studied empirically, but there may also be something like tracking at a higher conceptual level. So I have an image here of research on so-called concept cells, and you might think of what these concept cells do. So these are fairly localizable populations of neurons that seem to fire whenever, at the personal level, someone recognizes what they take to be the same individual. But what's interesting is that they fire regardless of the particular way in which that individual is presented. So they seem to function a bit more like what in François' terminology you would call encyclopedia files. They seem to be a way of representing or tracking the same individual, but even if that individual is represented across some lower level differences, as Evans would put it. So if, in fact, the Freudian theory cannot account for the relativity feature, and if it's right that on its face this relativity feature is something fairly common, that's, I think, a deep issue for Freudians. However, I don't think it's right that this is such an incredibly hard-to-solve puzzle. There's a fairly simple, let's say, general shape of a solution, though there's all sorts of interesting issues to be worked out in more detail, which is to appeal to something like dynamic mental files. And so here I added a quote after this morning's talk by David, where David, in fact, says what you said he says. He says, when you have a difference in conceptions, we have no need to hypothesize a difference in concept in order to explain behavioral difference. So that's the basic way to try to answer Schiffer. And if you think of this in terms of something like a language of thought, you get Prosser's view, which was already discussed earlier today. So as Prosser puts it in 2005, the dynamic view requires supplementation by an account of singular modes of presentation that are not individuated in terms of anything that is specific to just one indexical term. So someone who thinks of the attitudes in terms of a language of thought, for example, can simply say that in the transition between indexicals, there is a symbol that is retained, and while another symbol is exchanged. So the symbol that's retained we can think of as the same dynamic file. I think of files as mental vehicles, pointers to addresses in memory. And then you have entries inside the file, and those change. So note that on Prosser's view, you do have both psychological and linguistic modes of presentation. He draws that distinction following François' 1993 book. So you have something like the quality of here-ness, which is represented, or hereaboutness was one way of putting it, in your file for a place that you think of as here. And then when you think of what you take to be the same place when your relation to it has changed as there, it's still numerically the same file over time, but you update an entry inside the file, and you represent whatever the characteristic way in which you think of a place as there. And you have, therefore, something that changes and something that stays the same, where what changes might be different than simply the linguistic mode of presentation, something like the Kaplanian character. So that's, I think, elegant, simple, but it does face a few objections. So one kind of objection is we might worry that it doesn't account for important difference between different ways in which your representational state changes when you represent the world in different ways. So here's another example from Burge, which I think is interesting. It says, imagine you're looking at some object, and it's a perceptual case again, and your eyes go blurry for a moment, and then you focus again. Well, there's some change in your representational state, and that change might play some role in explaining your behavior. So maybe what you ought to do is blink or focus your eyes or something of that sort. But you don't typically attribute the change to the object itself. You represent it as merely a subjective change in your own state, perhaps in something like what the means you use to represent the world. I would say it's a vehicular change, though Burge wouldn't like that. And so this contrasts with cases in which you represent a change in the properties of an individual. And this makes a difference to your representational state itself. It's something that makes a psychological difference to the explanation of your behavior. And so intermediary between perhaps these two cases, there's the issue of how we account for relational or perspectival or indexical change. So I understand François' view, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, to be saying that it's at least not obvious that when you change the way you are contextually related to an object, this is exactly the same psychologically as simply, say, objective or attributive change. And so we might need a more fine-grained model, and what this would amount to in file terms is we might wonder whether any kind of relevant change to your psychological state for explaining your behavior should simply be explained in terms of updating entries inside your file, or whether you need to draw some more differences. Other objection, this has been discussed a lot, so it's a very general way of putting the objection, is simply to appeal to broadly Phrygian criteria for differentiating concepts or modes of presentation. So thought constituents will correspond to different concepts or modes of presentation, and then you have some more internalist and some more externalist criteria, so you can basically pick whichever ones you like. They correspond to different ways of thinking. They play different epistemic or cognitive roles. They allow for some kind of doubt about whether or not the constituents co-refer. They allow you to rationally attribute incompatible properties. Maybe they're based on different epistemically rewarding relations. Maybe they correspond to different modes of reference determination, have different origins, or don't conditionally or actually co-refer. And depending on how much of an internalist or an externalist you are, you might, in all these cases, argue that this shows that you're dealing with different concepts in cognitive dynamics cases. So you'll say that the thought constituents that are expressed by different indexicals satisfy some or all of these criteria, so the concepts must be different. And I think there's two main strategies for replying to this kind of objection. And probably the main one is to accept some version of the criteria, but argue that they don't actually apply to cognitive dynamics. So perhaps the criteria only apply at a single time, or we discussed this view defended by Campbell and more recently by François, doubt should reflect a particular subject's actual dispositions and so on. But there's a more radical way of answering these kinds of criticisms, which is to say that we can question the relevance of these general criteria as far as individuating or differentiating concepts construed as mental files goes. So this is what I call a radical vehicularist reply. If you think files are vehicles, well, as I understand what it means to be a vehicle, it's something that has a content, but isn't defined by its content or by its referent or by how its reference is determined, though it might be the case that the epistemic access we have to vehicles goes through intentional referential semantic properties. And against internalist criteria, well, a more radical reply is to say it's not the case that files, if they're vehicles, are individuated by their cognitive rules. And I think this point is made by Jerry Fodor. So he says that type-identical vehicle tokens can differ in their causal roles because the role that a token plays depends not just on which type it's a type of, but also on the rest of the world in which its tokening transpires. This is true of the causal roles of symbols because it's true of the causal roles of everything. Roughly, your causal role depends on what you are, what the local laws are, and, as he puts it, what else there is around. So in terms of files, you might have the notion of the total causal role of a file, and that would be a role that's defined by the role of what François would call the file itself, which others might call simply the pointer, the address that locates a certain memory, a certain store of information, but also whatever role entries or conceptions play, plus perhaps, and this brings us back to the first objection, perhaps there's something else, some other way that the causal role of a file can be impacted by something apart from simply the entries it contains. So maybe the relations it stands in to the world. Whatever X is, whatever this additional factor is, either it contributes to the file's cognitive role or it doesn't. But if it doesn't, well, it's probably irrelevant to psychological explanation, and since our goal is to explain subject psychology by appealing to files and how they're individuated, we can exclude this factor. If it does, then it is relevant to psychological explanation, but that's Fodor's point. It still doesn't need to be individuated of files. So this reply pushes you in the direction of some kind of atomism, but people can ask me about this, I guess, in discussion. I don't think it leads necessarily to full-blown conceptual atomism. So on this view, files as vehicles, this is a view that's been presented today. It dates back to Crimmins and Perry, are some kind of particulars. Here's what I mean by that. They come into types, so you have something like the type, by analogy, the type American flag. Types contain occurrences, so you have abstract types within types, so you have multiple occurrences of the type star and the type American flag, as Wetzel points out. And then you have various tokens, token flags, and as I think of tokens, within those tokens you can have particular token stars, but the same token star, so imagine that you sew a star that you took from one flag and then use it for another flag. I would say you're reusing the same token, but its use in this new occurrence has changed. So my view of mental vehicles is the same kind of thing can happen. I think that helps to see why they may not be individuated by something like their role, since that depends on what else is around. So the view I have of files is what I've called elsewhere a psychofunctionalist approach, according to which traditional Frege so-called difference, criteria of difference, simply provide defeasible evidence for individuating files, since files are these theoretical posits. We hope they're real, and ultimately we hope they'll be typed by whatever aspects of their psychofunctional role end up being most relevant in our mature cognitive scientific models, but that means, as of yet, we don't have to provide anything like strict criteria. And I think in order to maximize their explanatory potentials, files should be robust, as that notion is sometimes used in the philosophy of science, which means roughly that we should seek multiple independent routes to files, modes of epistemic determination that allow us to triangulate on their identity. And this should include not only our traditional a priori criteria, but whatever empirical psychological signatures we can come up with. So an example of this, which I discuss in other work, is the way that object-specific preview benefits are used in perception as evidence of the sameness or of the difference of object files. So my view is that an advantage of this is that if files are independent with respect to the personal level, dispositions to represent things as the same, this helps files to potentially explain those dispositions rather than merely redescribe them, contrary perhaps to the view of Blazikovic. So maybe we'll discuss that later. And I also think if that's how you think of files, well, it might be fine to say that if you're doing logic or normative epistemology, inferences are something synchronic that you can idealize as taking place at one time. But if our goal is to use them as tools to study actual cognitive processes in psychology and cognitive science, well, it's fairly clear that those are diachronic, and we need to have things to say about when we're dealing with the same or different files through time. So that being said, well, if we want files to be robust, one way to proceed is to try to seek various different phenomena where they might play some kind of role and to look at neighboring areas of investigation. So this brings me to the case of 10 minutes, polysemy. So here's an example. It might not be a perfect example of polysemy, but it had a nice illustration. So Capitaine Haddock gulped down the bottle, then tossed it overboard. Anaphora goes through. You have representing as the same by that test. But yet, if you think about it for a minute, well, what he gulped down cannot be what he tossed overboard, right? Because he drank the contents, and he certainly would not have thrown the contents overboard. So the way Collins describes polysemy says a word is polysemous if and only if it may selectively or simultaneously support distinct but conceptually related construals. So say bottle can refer either to the container or to its contents. And as he notes, the problem, what's interesting about polysemy is how you could at the same time marry simultaneity and selectivity. And a sort of defining feature of what's sometimes known as logical or inherent polysemy is precisely that it supports anaphora across differences in senses and that it passes a co-predication test. I have a bunch of examples, but in the interest of time, I won't read any, but we could go back to them if you don't like my initial example. And an idea that emerges from the literature on polysemy is that we need something like what are sometimes known as dot concepts to account for it. One reason is the following, so I'll read a quote by Nick Asher. What he calls accidental polysemy, which is homonymy, and logical polysemy differ in several linguistically discernible ways. For instance, logically polysemous words pass the co-predication and anaphora tests, while accidentally polysemous terms don't. First point, so we need some way to distinguish it from mere homonymy. Furthermore, logical polysemy, I think this is important for files, isn't just a matter of association. One reason to see this is that the association between cars and individuals who drive them is at least as clear as the informational relation between physical objects and informational objects. So say a book in two different senses. But you can't say, I'm parked out back and am an old Volvo. So the explanation can't just be in terms of association. Many people, including Asher, say we need to postulate what are known as dot objects, which are of a complex type. So books are equally physical and informational objects, though there is no sense in which I'm equally a person in my car. Regardless of what you say about the metaphysics, however, Asher says that such big metaphysical differences should be and are reflected in our conceptual scheme. So I think this provides a motivation for postulating something that could play this role. I'll call these dot files, not so originally. So here's the general picture. You can represent as if they're the same, the bottle and both of its senses. And I think this means you're representing it via a unique file, but you need to consider that file to have enough structure to also draw the distinctions you want to draw between the different senses. So I would say this corresponds to different subfiles. And I think you also need some complexity in the inner structure of the file to represent the relations between those subfiles, so say the containment relation. And so when you think under one particular sense, what you do is you activate some particular subfile. Maybe subfiles tend to be based on certain epistemically rewarding relations, which makes them composite, but which relation is active varies across time according to how you construe the referent, if there is one, the reference, if there are several, and all that is going on, I would claim, within the same file. So the picture is that dot files are both composite and dynamic, meaning that they're neither type nor token individuated by epistemically rewarding relations, but they're fed by several, which can be selectively activated dynamically. A consequence is that not all representational changes correspond to some kind of update or change in entries, nor to emerging or linking of files. And operations of modulation and meaning within files occur when a subfile corresponding to a particular construal or way of thinking of the referent gets activated. Though in some cases, of course, on this picture, you can deploy a pointer to a whole file. So a nice example by Jake Quilty-Dunn, who's done a lot to develop this kind of view of concepts, is he says, well, you can simply think, I'm sitting near the window. And it's not obvious that you have to decide on a particular sense of window. You can just think that and also draw some consequences. And I think this kind of complex structure may be inherited by particular files from more general templates, which helps explain some of the developmental learning data. So what's my parity argument? Well, the basic idea is that inherent polysemy is best explained by the same file being deployed across different senses or construals. But if you appeal to differences in ways of representing, I think the criteria for differentiating modes of presentation at least very plausibly apply to different senses. I think those are really different ways of thinking of the referent, or perhaps the reference. And the parity would claim that this suggests that the criteria aren't generally reliable for individuating files, so all other things equal, we shouldn't rely on them in cases of cognitive dynamics either, which at least supports the idea that files may, in fact, remain the same cross-contextually in cognitive dynamics cases. So I have a fairly detailed slide, but it's mostly appealing to a bunch of empirical data that's been presented in more detail by Jake Quilty-Dunn about arguments for saying that we have a unique representation for polysemous concepts, as one might put it. The basic point is that it explains, I think, very nicely the contrast between inherent polysemy and mere homonymy. But also there's a lot of sort of processing and reaction times data. There's some neurolinguistic evidence, and there's also some developmental evidence. And I think there's a few interesting similarities with the cases of the signature effects of object files and perception. So I can come back to some of this, or I can point people to Jake's very nice opinionated review of the literature. As for this involving different ways of thinking of the same referent, well, the basic point about polysemy is that it usually involves incompatible construals. I have an example that might not be perfect for my purposes, but it's something Mathieu said yesterday, and I liked it, so I thought I'd cite it. He said, this is a joint talk, but it's not a joint talk, if you noticed. And so this obviously is trading on the fact that you have different senses, and that means he wasn't rationally contradicting himself, and this suggests different modes of presentation, in this case, at least of the properties expressed, and so that seems to be reason to postulate different modes of presentation. It's at least doubtful that there's de jure coreference, for instance, because different construals of, say, a book correspond to different ways of counting books. This is a classic argument. I'm not always sure how to count epistemically rewarding relations, but it seems you can't, as far as I can tell, stand in the same one to entities of entirely different ontological categories. And in terms of cognitive roles, kind of Perrian style argument, say my university construed as a building is falling apart, I ought to request for it to be repainted. If it's falling apart sort of morally and politically, I ought to campaign for better governance. These are not the same behaviors. So the view that emerges is that the identity of a token file corresponds to something I would put sort of inspired by Fine as representing as if the same, to not really commit to it being representing as the same, where interestingly, things that you represent as if they're the same might not be judged upon reflection to be identical to one another. Different occurrences of a token dot file aren't guaranteed to co-refer, would refer particular uses or modulated occurrences of files. I would reject the consequence that that means files don't have the proper function to refer, however. And in this view, different uses or construals correspond to different cognitive roles, though we might argue, following Francois, that perhaps, although files in general don't satisfy these criteria, maybe their specific particular uses do. So terminologically, I say dot files are concepts, and I say the same concept can contain different modes of presentation. You might not want to draw that distinction in those terms. What matters, I think, is that dot files do explain personal level behavior, and they subserve categorization and inference. They'll all remain neutral concerning the exact relationship between dot files and linguistic meanings. So what about the claim that there's some kind of parity here of cognitive dynamics? Well, at least abstractly speaking, some of the reasons you might want to maintain or deny that indexicality only concerns linguistic expression as opposed to thought, I think, apply in a very similar way to polysemy. In any case, I would reject any strong version of the parity claim. I don't claim that thinking about polysemy rebuts the thesis that cognitive dynamics requires different concepts. But I do endorse a more modest version of this parity claim, which is that inherent polysemy at least stresses the compatibility of file identity and representing in different ways, and that at least shifts the burden of proof towards opponents of dynamic files. Should I stop here? Should I discuss objections?
You have 1 more minute.
I'll mention one objection, because I think it's sort of interesting. Here's the objection that Collins, well, he doesn't present it as an objection to my view, but it's sort of an interesting claim. He says, look, there is no such thing as polysemy. It's all zeugma. It's all an illusion. And the reason he thinks this, and he sort of says, here's a prediction that it makes, is that if you present to naive subjects inferences like the following, they should reject them. So London is expensive, but it's cheerful. So something is expensive, but cheerful. He says that's bad. And the reason this is interesting is that this, of course, resembles so-called trading on identity, which is sometimes taken to be a kind of criterion for conceptual sameness. So if the rejection of existential generalization or trading on identity does, in fact, correspond to conceptual difference, yet, as seems to be the case, subjects wrongly think they're deploying the same concept, because usually people don't think that they're thinking different concepts when they're thinking simply of London. It seems that Collins's account would involve a violation of the transparency of difference for concepts. So that's interesting. My reply would be, well, maybe concepts as vehicles aren't transparent. I'm open to that possibility. I've discussed it elsewhere. But I don't think this is a strong argument for that view, since, as I see it, whether or not you accept the existential generalization mostly depends on how you read the existential quantifier. If you think of it as sort of ontologically committal, you might not like introducing it, but I don't think the intuition has anything to do with basically trading on identity across the premises. I think it concerns strictly the move to introducing that quantifier. So for instance, I don't know what you think, but if you have, London is an expensive city, but it's cheerful. So some city's expensive, but cheerful. I don't think that's shocking at all. What is sort of weird is saying, so something is a city which is expensive but cheerful, and that might just be because we don't like inferences ending in something is an F from, A is an F in natural language. We do this in logic class, but when you do it in natural language, it sounds kind of weird. So I would resist the claim that this tells us anything interesting about the concept of London. I think it tells us something interesting about how much people like introducing the existential quantifier. To sum up, I think dynamic and composite dot files help to account for inherent logical polysemy. You might wonder whether the indexical short answer, not really, maybe in a Peircean sense, but they're not type or token individuated by contextual relations. What about our leading question, are files expressed by different indexicals the same, are they different? I haven't answered that question, but my hope is that considering this phenomenon of polysemy undercuts at least some motivation for claiming the files have to be different when the indexical changes, and in keeping with the general psychofunctionalist approach, I think our way to approach these questions should be to try to make the empirical commitments of various different models very clear. So what does it mean to say we have different files but they're converted, or different files but they're linked, as opposed to identical files, and seek relevant evidence. Thank you very much for your attention.